fiber and those without fiber. And that affects or impacts where they're digested in the horse's stomach or GI system. And we'll talk about that here shortly. So two types of carbohydrates, fiber and those that do not have fiber. Like I say, it's one of probably the greatest source of energy we can provide to a horse. And I'll give you some examples. So the fiber fiber carbohydrate, also referred to as non-soluble carbohydrate. This particular nutrient is digested in the horse's large colon. So we're talking not their stomach, not their small intestine, but farther back in the large colon. And the large colon in a horse, and I think we have some diagrams in your handouts, the large colon of the horse is kind of unique to that animal, and it's similar to what the rumen is like in a cow or a goat or a sheep, in that there's microbes or bacteria and other healthy little bugs that are needed to break down fiber and other components in the feed. And without those, the horse could not utilize those nutrients. And so hay, grasses, those are called forage, or that's referred to as forage. Without those little guys, those little microbes doing their job in the horse's large colon, that horse would not be able to utilize that nutrient at all. And so fiber is generally from the stem or leaf component of the plant, and that is something that has to travel. When the horse consumes it, it travels through the stomach, through the small intestine with very little digestive process at that point. But once it gets to the large colon, that's where it's broken down, and that's where the nutrients are extracted. Then your non-fiber carbohydrates, these are going to be broken down earlier. So these are going to be broken down in the small intestine, and they're not broken down by bacteria or protozoa or microbes. They're broken down by enzymes in the body. And so people always ask about like probiotics for horses. Is that going to be helpful? Well, sure, it can be, but it's not going to help the entire GI tract. It's not going to do anything for the small intestine or the stomach. It may help what's going on in the large colon, because that's where the microbes live, and the probiotic is designed to try to improve the health of those microbes. But for a nutrient like this, which is usually your oats, your starches, your sugars, it is not going to be impacted by microbes. It's going to be broken down in the foregut or the small intestine. And I bring one particular carbohydrate up. That's fructan. Fructan is a carbohydrate, non-fiber, that's found a lot of times in our cool season grasses, especially around here, and it's in higher concentration in the early stages of growth. So we're usually talking about late spring, early summer. Sometimes in the fall we can get a regrowth like we did this year, where these fructan levels can jump up. The problem with fructan is if it's in high concentration, it goes into the gut, gets digested, it can cause some things to change as far as the happiness and the well-being of the gut. And that can affect the microbes farther back in the colon. And if those healthy bacteria and microbes are not happy, they're going to start to die out, and we're going to start getting bacteria that we don't want in the gut, and that can lead to a whole host of problems. And so laminitis or founder is one of those problems. This can affect a horse who's on grasses. We see it a lot around here, especially in the early summer when horses are turned out on lush green grass, immature grasses. These fructan levels are really high at that point. The horse consumes them. That leads to changes in the gut that can cause toxins to basically be produced in the bloodstream of the horse. And what we think happens is that goes down to the foot, and that leads to the problems that laminitis can bring. And again, a whole host of things can go wrong, but laminitis is a common one. So I just want to share that shortly, and we can talk about more of that later too. And again, if we need to provide a horse energy in a hurry, let's say this is a race horse, this is a performance horse, a horse that's under a lot of demand, burning a lot of calories, consuming a lot of nutrients. If we need to get energy in that horse fast and have them utilize it quickly, this is the way to go. You can't see this, but I think of carbohydrates is lollipops and sugar, and those are my kids, and they don't need this because they look happy here, but they'll go crazy after this. And you may have a happy horse and you give them this, and they may turn into my kids. So keep that in mind. Yeah. All right, fats, my favorite. Fats are also a great energy source. In fact, they're superior to most other nutrients as far as what kind of energy they can provide to the body. And they serve a lot of purpose. I think we'll touch on it later on, but when we have a horse that maybe is undernourished, underconditioned, fats are a good way of improving weight gain and condition on those horses. One other thing to bring up on fats as well is that although they're found in many of our common diets, in forages, so like hays, pasture grasses, they're at very, very low amounts. So where like minerals, vitamins, proteins, carbs are pretty represented in all of our common feed types for horses, fats are deficient in that area. So if we need them, we oftentimes have to supplement fat. But again, not every horse needs it, and we'll go into that a little bit more. So here's some examples of supplements that we can provide the horses for fat. A lot of you probably heard about these. Vegetable oils, there's a number of, they're a good source, they're cheap, they're easy to provide, quite palatable in general, but fats are an area where if you overdo it or you don't have the right type, your horse may lose interest in eating. It can affect their palatability. And if we do add too much at one time, sometimes that can lead to changes in the health of their gut. That could lead to diarrhea, for example. And then as a horse owner, you might also want to think about how you're storing these types of feed, because this is one component of like our complete feeds, for example, that if the bag's left open or it's not in a proper storage setting, it may go rancid, and that may cause your horse to shy away from it as well. Briefly on oils. Oils are fats. They're just a liquid version of it. There's many different types of oils that people use. I think the take home from this is you hear about omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. They are a component to fats. Omega-3s serve as kind of a healthy, natural anti-inflammatory to the horse. And omega-6s are kind of the opposite. So we want to maintain, or ideally want the horse to maintain kind of a nice ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. And I only bring this up not because you have to necessarily remember all that, but the different oils that are commonly used, so linseed oil, sunflower oil, sapphire oil, corn oils on the end here, sorry you can't see it. They have different levels of both the omega-3 and omega-6, and the take home here might be linseed oil might be the top of my list if I had to choose a fat oil for a horse. And I usually talk about, starting a horse at 1 to 2 cups per day. You can certainly increase that if you need to, but that might be something that if you're looking to put weight on a horse, In addition to a complete feed, oil, a fat oil might be an option to help that horse pick up some weight. Mineral oils, or sorry, mineral oil. Minerals. Minerals are another component. I'm just going to touch on these guys and vitamins fairly briefly. Not to underplay them, they're certainly important, but there's less that we have to really worry about in these areas compared to the nutrients we've already talked about. And that's because they're generally readily available in most of our hays, pasture grasses, and really the two that I would think about, or the three I think about, are first of all salt, sodium chloride. Every horse should have access to that at any time, and that's vital to the body for many reasons. Water consumption that we talked about earlier is probably the key there. So whether your horse is stabled in a barn with limited turnout time or controlled nutrients, or pasture turned out, salt availability should always be present, and especially this time of year when, and we'll talk about this later on, where water intake can really vary with the first big storms we're having. And so we want to make sure salt is available. It can sometimes make that horse a little more consistent as far as their water intake, and that can make for a happier gut, happier health. And then finally, selenium is another one I just want to bring up. You know, this gets thrown around a lot, and this map here represents different selenium concentrations in soils throughout the U.S. With the orange being kind of low selenium areas, the green moderate, and blue high. And so we can run into problems with high or low selenium levels in the horse, but I want you to look at all the colors in Montana. It's really hard to know where your horse stands with all that. And it's a component of maybe pasture that they're grazing on, what's in the soil, and then travels to the plant that the horse consumes, where that hay comes from. And I would say, as a veterinarian, it's pretty darn rare that I come across a horse with selenium problems. There's lots of mineral and vitamin supplements out there that contain selenium that you can choose and provide your horse. And in general, we don't see toxicities either, but it is probably less of a problem than I think it's been in livestock in the past. We just don't see it much for horses around here. Now, that's just in our area. There's other parts of the country where it's a bigger issue. Again, vitamins are another key nutrient that we're going to just briefly pass through. Again, they're certainly very important, but luckily we don't oftentimes have to interfere here. With vitamins and minerals in general, when it comes to whether you need to supplement your horse or not, and this puts salts as an exception, because I think every horse should have that available at all times. But as far as your other elements or your other minerals and vitamins go, certainly the more your horse has worked, what that horse is doing, is it a mare with a foal growing inside of her? Is it a young horse developing? Is it a horse with some other underlying health problem? Or is it a performance horse? That's really going to dictate the need of whether you have to do this or not. And certainly knowing more about what you're feeding currently will help you better understand what or what not you need to do to change it. And so Dr. Keene will go through that a little bit more as far as testing forages and knowing what you have before you decide what you need. Okay, so all those nutrients put together, the goal is to provide energy to the body. And like I say, energy really powers everything we do, or everything how the horse's body works. It's produced from all these nutrients. Predominantly though, fats, proteins, and carbs are where energy is coming from, and the horse will digest this in different parts of their gut, and that can lead to more efficiency and more readily available energy at any time, depending on what they're eating and where it's digested. Calories, we've all heard that term. That's just basically a term we use to discuss energy and how much energy we need. So energy is stored in the body as well, and the main areas are in the gut. So as the colon, the intestines are digesting, they're going to be extracting energy. And as we all know, horses tend to ideally consume feed one way or the other the majority of their day or 24-hour period if they have that choice. And so there's always energy usually being processed and produced in the gut. But the liver, fat stores, and muscle stores are also areas where energy can be utilized from. And so if a horse is dealing with low energy, it's going to take it from wherever it can. So carbohydrates, again, if you give that horse sugar, if you give that horse a lollipop, they're going to have energy right away. Just like an endurance athlete taking a carbohydrate gel, it's going to be in their system within a matter of minutes, and they can utilize it. But once they use that up, they're going to be looking to get it from elsewhere. And fats are, again, a great energy source. It takes a little bit longer to process and produce energy, but still a very efficient process with little expenditure to the body. And so fats in our diet and fat stores in the horse can serve as great opportunities for the horse to get energy in a hurry. Proteins, again, just the digestive system, they're still a reasonable energy source. They just take longer to get. So if your horse is low energy, maybe you feel like, nutrition-wise, it needs a little more of a to kind of get that horse to do what you want to do, or maybe fatigue is an issue. These are some things to think about. Are you going to get it from protein, fats, or carbohydrates? And that might just depend on what that horse is doing. Is it a race horse? Is it a barrel racing horse versus an endurance horse? There's totally different ways those horses utilize and extract energy. And so depending on what that horse does and the timely manner you need that energy may influence what you supplement with. Is it a grain? Is it a fat supplement? Or is it more protein? I think you guys have a handout too in your book here, but I think body condition scoring is a good goal for any horse owner. As a veterinarian, it's a subjective way of just kind of keeping track of a horse's body condition and their weight, and there's a lot of details to how this is achieved, but it's easy to pick out the outliers. A horse that's way under nutrition, poor body condition, or the horse that's really obese and fat. But in the middle, things can be a little bit harder to pick up. And it depends on the breed of the horse in many ways what you might be looking for. So for example, a thoroughbred racehorse, a healthy body condition might be somewhere in the 3 to 4 range, where a quarter horse, like a cutting horse or a reining horse, you might be looking at that 4 to 5 range, and versus like a dressage horse, a warm blood might be even higher, 6, maybe even 7. But it just depends on the breed, and it's a good way for you as a horse owner to kind of not necessarily put a number with your horse all the time, but where you should be looking at to see if, he's starting to get a little more fat or crest to his neck, or his top line is starting to, become a little more prominent, or he's losing some muscling in his gluteal region or his hips. Those are areas that you can look at to decide if your horse is in a reasonable, healthy condition from an appearance standpoint. So some things to think about here as far as feeding practices and goals. Like I mentioned from the start, there's no perfect nutrient or no perfect diet you can give to each and every horse. Just like everybody in this room, La Panitas may agree with some of you and it may not for others. But we want to have a good balanced diet. And so we got to think about those 6 nutrients. And like I say, some of them we don't really have to worry about in most cases. But depending on what your horse does, what availability you have for nutrients, your horse managed in a stable versus turned out in the pasture, what's the condition of your pasture, all those things are going to influence your decisions as far as what's best to feed your horse. But again, age of the horse, their use, health status, and then certain times of year, obviously we all know that, this time of year, most of our horses are going to more of a dry matter sort of feed. So haze, low in water, in many cases harder to digest or more challenging to digest compared to springtime grasses. And so it is something that just because you fed your horse this way as a 3-year-old doesn't mean that when they're a 13-year-old, you can still feed them that same way. And we're lucky here in this part of the country that by and large we have access to a lot of quality feedstuffs, whether it's hays produced locally, other parts of the country, there's limited options on what horses can have, especially in stable settings. So we're pretty fortunate to at least have that kind of flexibility in this area where we can make the best decision for the horse and not be limited. Dr. Keene's going to go through some of this a little bit more, but for forages like grasses and hays, in general, that should make up the bulk of what the horse consumes on any daily basis. So you can't, or you shouldn't, no one's saying you can't, but you shouldn't be relying on like a complete feed for your horse is the majority of their diet. They still need that hay, they still need that roughage. And that is generally fed at least a 2% by body weight amount. And so for a horse that's has no job, let's say it's a 13-year-old gelding that just hangs out, and it's, reasonable conditions outside. It's not too cold, it's not too hot. That horse should be receiving about 2% body weight in forage. That a horse in a stable that's fed 2 or 3 times a day is going to be higher risk of colic almost always compared to a horse that has 24-hour access to pasture and feed. And so that's not always obvious or option for a lot of horse owners. A lot of people don't have pasture, they can do that. So we do the best what we can but hays and forages in general are going to be very vital to stabled horses because that's going to be what takes the longest time to digest. That's what's going to be keeping the gut happy throughout the day if they only get fed 2 or 3 times a day. And we can sometimes see horses that are on feeds that are easier or quicker to digest, like grains. These horses can get bored, or they, behaviorally, they may start to change as far as how they act in a stall compared to a horse that's given free choice access to hay throughout the day. That's just kind of a subjective or opinion, but I don't know if anybody else can comment on that, but I do think that if a horse is only fed a couple times a day, and otherwise they're standing around with little to do, we're going to see more problems, whether it be colic or sometimes behavioral issues in that horse that's dealing with full-time access to feed. So our common hay types, there's certainly more, but I want to just address what we kind of have around here in this part of the region. And those are generally our alfalfa versus our cool season grasses. So those are like orchard grass or timothy. There's pros and cons to each one of these. Certainly, in my opinion, it goes back to what is best for that individual horse, and also what you have the availability to, and what may be the best quality as far as what you have. Alfalfa, generally more palatable. Horses like the taste of it. They can get more energy and protein from it in general compared to timothy or orchard grass. It is this little number here, higher non-fiber carbohydrates. That's important, and I think Dr. Keene will talk about that, but think about the horse that may have equine metabolic syndrome, or a horse that's had a history of founder laminitis. That might be something to stay away from if you can choose, but there are ways of working around that. On the flip side, timothy or orchard grass can have some concerns in certain horses too. Slower digestive time, lower protein, higher fiber. Those may be an advantage, they may not, depending on what you're doing with your horse, what their daily life is like, and if they have any special requirements or additional energy or nutrients that they need. Hay quality, there's kind of 2 ways you can pick through this. I'm just going to say this real quick because Dr. Keene's going to discuss it, but obviously from an appearance of the hay, we can kind of get a subjective understanding as far as what we may think of the quality of the hay. And so first off, like, is it alfalfa, is it grass, is it mix, is there weeds in it, is there other plants that may be kind of contaminating it or lessening the nutritional value? Maturity, when was it harvested? Is it, if it's a mature grass, again, it's going to have maybe higher fiber, lower water, potentially lower carbohydrates compared to a younger grass, or a cool season grass that's maybe cut earlier in the year. Color, not necessarily a big deal, but obviously if there's dust or smell to it, that might be an indication of mold or other contaminants. And then there is chemical analysis that you can do, and Dr. Keene will talk about that. I'm just going to skip through this real quick, but this is just, again, this is an example of just a cool season grass. As it matures and goes through these different stages, leafy, boot, heading, and bloom, the dry weight or dry matter content basically of the plant increases. And so a horse that's out on pasture, and again in June here compared to in August, might be receiving less moisture and potentially more fiber. So that could impact how that horse is able to digest that feed. And then the hay forms. the quick take home from this is two things. One, forage is forage, and whether you feed a horse with a square bale, a round bale, hay pellets, or hay cubes, it still has the same benefit as far as what I talked about earlier. And the majority of the horse's diet should consist of forage versus other things like grains. So even in a pelleted form, it's still going to be processed in the large colon of the horse, just like grasses or hays would. And the other thing I like to bring up is that things to think about as far as considering different hay forms might be, say, dental health of the horse. Horses that have poor dental health may benefit more from a feed that they can chew and break down a little easier. Availability. You have access to hay all the time. If you're traveling with your horse, going to rodeos or shows frequently, or you're up in the mountains with your horses on a hunting trip, you may not have access to your hay, and you may have to haul your supplies, and that may impact what you're feeding at that time. And so, obviously, cost is a big component here. These things all cost different dollars and cents, and you have to add up what works best for you and your situation. And then hay cutting. My take home on this is that if you're trying to find the hay that's first, second, or third cutting around here, that's probably not as important as just what the quality is. And that's going to vary. And unfortunately, it's hard to predict ahead of time. And that's where maybe a hay analysis is an appropriate thing to do, to know more about what you're getting or what you're going to be feeding to your horse. But to say, like, I would choose third cutting over first cutting alfalfa, I think is kind of a little bit too general of a thought. There's too much variability, even from year to year or field to field. And then pasture grazing, like I mentioned earlier, in the ideal world, this is what the horse would be doing. Grazing time, a little over half or majority of their time, versus short feedings 2 or 3 times a day. This is a question that always gets brought up, and when is the best time to let your horse graze in a pasture? And unfortunately, there's not a right answer, and there may not be a wrong answer, but there's a lot of variables to keep in mind, and Dr. Equine is going to talk about this more. And then just a brief summary here. Proper nutrition is equal to a balanced diet. We can't assume that one feed works for every horse. And depending on what your horse does, their age, their use, their breed, is going to impact what their needs are. And then obviously on the practical side of things, we have to think about cost, where we keep our horse, what options we have. And again, at least around here, we're pretty lucky compared to other parts of the country that we have some, I would say, more options than none. And then energy is the most important component, and that's really what the nutrients provide to the body. Okay. I'm going to switch it over to Dr. Equine here, and he's going to also present some information on nutrition, and then we'll go into our next topic. But nutrients or nutrition and colic are really going to be tied together with what we're discussing tonight. And so while Dr. Equine's switching over, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody may have. On what? 9? Tell me a little more. You're talking about like a difference in concentrations, or? Well, with the oil, 3, 6, and the 9. Omegas, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. What about it? Yeah. So that's that linoleic acid. It's a fatty acid that it's not available in any other way to the body other than in fat. And so I can't tell you all the reasons why it's important, but it is a component that if we don't provide it, we could run into some health issues. It is, yeah. And I think linseed oil, again, seems to be at the top of the list as far as providing that, not only the 3, but also the 6 in moderation as well as the 9. Yeah, I'm not sure where hemp lies. You know, fish oil would probably be at the top of the list, but it's just too expensive, I think, and smells. Um, but like corn oil, a lot of people like corn oil, but it's not going to provide, I think, 9, and it's going to have too much 6s, and that's a bad amino acid, or a bad fatty acid. Yeah. Yeah. Hold on just a second here. Yep. Yeah, what's up? As far as like dust reducers, things like that, or it's like a big thing on the market